This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Jeff Tiberii. Author Lauren Collins worked on her latest book for a decade. While doing so, she left a Post-it on her wall that she looked at every day.
And I wrote, America's only coup, and then what? And that was the question I was really trying to answer, is like, what were the consequences? What happened afterwards, and how is this still resonating today?
Her new book is titled They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. Collins, the author, says white supremacy is a through line in American history.
Not a flashback or a regression or a blip. And 1898 demonstrates that white supremacists will take what they think is theirs until the consequences of such acts outweigh the spoils.
This hour, we hear from the author of a new text about North Carolina's darkest chapter. First, the news. From the studios of WUNC News in Chapel Hill, this is Due South. I'm Jeff Tiberii. Of all the famous dates from American history you've heard, there is perhaps one you haven't heard enough. November 10th, 1898. If you live in North Carolina, or anywhere in this country really, it should be emblazoned in your mind. But for so many, it's not. And for so long in our history, since 1898, that veil, that wall, was there by design. The Wilmington massacre is the only successful coup d'etat in American history. Black elected officials were forced to resign office at gunpoint, and dozens, if not hundreds, of Black Wilmingtonians were killed on a day of premeditated terror. New York staff writer Lauren Collins grew up in Wilmington, yet was not taught anything close to the whole story of the massacre. So over the course of the past decade, she researched and wrote about it. Her new book is titled They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. Collins is based in Paris, but we got a chance to speak with her during her recent trip to Wilmington. And we started our conversation where the book begins, after Lauren saw a documentary directed by Christopher Everett.
So in 2016, I saw Chris's documentary, Wilmington on Fire, and it blew my mind. It told the story of the 1898 massacre and coup, and it argued that this was a story that needed to be known by all Wilmingtonians, but by extension by all North Carolinians, and I would say Americans too. And I agreed with this, and I thought, let me use the whatever platform I have to spread the word about this. So I decided to write a short article about Chris for The New Yorker, where I'm a staff writer. And as part of that, we met in Wilmington, and we went to the 1898 memorial. And, we got there, and I was reading the plaque that explained what had happened. It was this official history, kind of very tidy, tied up with a neat bow. And then I looked, and I saw that someone had made another sign, this kind of homemade guerrilla effort on a piece of plywood. Mm-hmm. They'd climbed up, nailed it to a telephone pole, and it said 1898 war crime. And the juxtaposition of these two messages told me that this was a live wire and that this history was still alive.
So this is 2016, and not to date you, but to place it in context, you're a grown-up at this point with a career writing for The New Yorker. You may or may not have kids at this point, but you're well on your way. But you just used the phrase, you said you were blown away by the documentary and then this subsequent visit, to a lesser degree perhaps, to the memorial. This was very much an education for you, despite the fact that you grew up in Wilmington, correct?
It was. So I will date myself. I'll do the work for you. I was born in Wilmington in 1980. And yes, in 2016, I was 36. I was indeed a grown-up, had kids of my own. And this was the first time. I had heard dribs and drabs of the story, but this was the first time I got it whole. Now, I was a senior in high school at New Hanover High School in 1998, the centennial year.
Wow.
And it was the first time that Wilmington sort of confronted and publicly commemorated the 1898 coup. But again, I was in high school there. We heard nothing of it. And for many, many years, this event was subject to private reticence and even a sort of public omerta. Cynthia Brown, who is one of the women I write about in the book, in the late 60s, went to the public library asking for information about it, and it was literally kept under lock and key. There was a librarian there who would kind of interview you and interrogate you about why you wanted this stuff, and if she decided that you might, I quote, make a stink, she would withhold it. And so Cynthia went looking for more. She's a descendant of one of the Black families who survived the coup, and she left empty-handed.
Wow. Okay, so she, and you write about her in the book. She comes back to be the head of human resources in Wilmington, where you grew up, which of course was the site of the massacre in 1898. So this woman, a Black woman who left the port city and comes back trying to learn more about this undertold at the time terrible chapter from American history, North Carolina history, and Wilmington history. She leaves empty-handed. But she doesn't ultimately remain empty-handed. What happened next for her, and how did she learn more about the real truth?
Well, so that was when she was in high school, when Cynthia kind of went to the library and tried to learn more and was repelled in a way. She went off to Chicago. She worked there for years and kind of in her, early 40s, decided to come home to Wilmington. And her father had intimated to her over the years that something had happened, but she didn't know the full story. And one day she was convened by one of her old teachers who gave her kind of this mysterious invitation to lunch. And Cynthia was busy. She was starting a new job. She was kind of like, I don't know if I really want to do this. But when your old teacher calls you and says, could you come to lunch? You're going to lunch. And she got there, and it was elegant, and it was an occasion. And it was full of Black educators of her parents' generation. And at the end of this lunch, they bestowed upon her a document that a relative of Cynthia's had written detailing what happened on the night of November 10th, 1898, when the Howe family lived through the massacre. And so there was this kind of bestowal upon Cynthia of this history and an injunction for her to keep it and conserve it and pass it on to the next generation.
As someone who grew up in Wilmington, I would like for you to try to go next level there. Was that scene, as you learned about it, wholly surprising, or was it closer to unsurprising?
Well, I think what I understood from that, there's a temptation to call the Wilmington coup and events like it hidden history is something I think we hear a lot. But it's not that this history was hidden. I mean, a lot of people knew about it, either because their relatives had, perpetrated it, those were the white families, or because their relatives, their ancestors' lives had been devastated or transformed or derailed by it. So I think what it taught me was that this history was there in our community, but there were reasons that it was warped and distorted and suppressed. In Wilmington, for example, the head of the Lower Cape Fear Historical Society for many years was the grandson of Colonel Roger Moore, who was one of the leaders of the coup. So, there are, like you said, there are layers of reasons that the truth has, that the truth has taken so long.
Lauren Collins with us here on Due South on the line from WHQR in Wilmington. She's the author of They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. We're coming up on a break here in a couple of minutes, but Lauren, I want to ask you if you're, comfortable adjudicating or leaning one way or the other. It's one. I'm going to acknowledge the librarian who's keeping things under a lock and key, but the lack of history, the lack of understanding, does it say more about people who are actively seeking to oppress it, or does it say more about folks who knew it but were afraid to speak up?
I think it's both. I mean, as soon as this event happened, at first, the men who created it, who planned it, and who executed it, called it the Wilmington Revolution, as though it were this kind of glorious revolt of oppressed people. And, from the beginning, there was this effort to shape and to kind of propagandize what really happened. But just because they were proud doesn't mean they were honest. The New Orleans massacre of 1866, for example, there was an inquest only several years after. For 1898, there was no formal investigation until 2000. So I think, the people who perpetrated this event remained in power, and they had a very, very strong hand for many years, well into the 20th century, on the interpretation of what had happened.
If you recall, it's been a little while now, what were you taught about 1898 as a young girl, a young woman growing up in Wilmington and in New Hanover County?
I don't think I was taught anything. I mean, what I had heard of it, I had heard maybe that there was a race riot. And that's when I ask people, that's what a lot of people say. Yeah, we heard there was a race riot sometime back there. That is a misnomer. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't a spontaneous spasm of violence. It was premeditated, and it was planned, and it was committed. It was perpetrated and executed by white supremacists. But yeah, so when I was growing up, I think there was very little education about this for some of the reasons I've mentioned. I mean, it wasn't accidental. Since then, the New Hanover County Schools has made some strides. I think there are some really good initiatives in the lower grades, but the North Carolina Department of Education doesn't mandate any follow-up at the high school level. And while New Hanover County Public Schools strongly recommends the inclusion of 1898 in American history courses, it's not mandatory. So I think there's still room for improvement.
And I will editorialize by asking the question, how can it not be mandated? It was, after all, the only successful coup in the history of the United States of America. It took place 128 years ago in the port city of Wilmington. And we're chatting about the incident, but also about the backstory, the moment, and the long legacy, a centuries-long legacy, with Lauren Collins. She's a journalist, staff writer at The New Yorker, and author of the recently released They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. Much more with Lauren Collins here in a moment on Due South on listener-supported WUNC News. Welcome back. It's Due South on listener-supported WUNC News. I'm Jeff Tiberii. Lauren Collins is our guest this hour. She's on the line from WHQR, public radio station in Wilmington, and we're talking about a notorious event, perhaps the most notorious event in the history of the port city, the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. As we were discussing before the break, Lauren, you gain a much better, deeper, more nuanced understanding of this as an adult, and you write an article about it for The New Yorker. But then you take what I would describe as a considerable, if not seismic step, of writing a book. When and why did you say, all right, like I've written the article, but that wasn't quite enough. I'm gonna spend a lot more time on this?
Well, I was telling you about this moment when I saw these signs, the neat official history, and then the kind of guerrilla sign. And it was, when I saw those, I realized that this was still being adjudicated, that this was not over, that this history was still alive, and it still had deep meaning and high stakes for people who are living today. So that just set something off in me. I mean, it took me a very long time to write this book. I worked on it for almost 10 years.
Wow.
And my mantra was kind of better right than fast. But once I understood that this was still a contested history, a history that was still emerging and that was still alive, I started thinking, first of all, I realized that the timeline had to be longer. I wanted to tell this story in its longitudinal fullness and to look at the qualitative consequences as well as the quantitative ones. What did it mean to lose? We know the political and economic consequences, but what did it mean to lose a home? What did it mean to lose friends, a community? What did it mean to be banished from a place that was all you knew? So as I started thinking about these questions, I realized that I wanted to examine this event as a multi-generational saga, as the intimate story of the families who lived it and are still living it today.
What does it mean to live in fear for the rest of your life after making it through the Wilmington massacre? And you certainly encapsulate some of that in this text, in this book. You track a number of families in your book. We're going to get to them in a moment. I think I want to ask first, and you're alluding to it here, this event happened in November of 1898, but the story, in some ways still permeating today, many ways still permeating today, extends for a long time. But let's go back to the beginning from your seat. Where does the story of the Wilmington massacre begin?
In my understanding and in my telling, it begins very early with the kind of, settling of America, with the enslavement of people, with the Civil War, with emancipation, and crucially with the failure of Reconstruction. I decided to start the story centuries earlier than other people might have chosen to. And as I said, I follow it all the way into the present day. But I mean, once I realized I was going to write this book, I had a Post-it. I wrote this out and I stuck it up on my wall and I looked at it every day. And I wrote America's only coup, and then what? And that was the question I was really trying to answer, is like, what were the consequences? What happened afterwards? And how is this still resonating today?
This is out of order, admittedly, but it's not on my script. I'm going to ask it anyway right now, and it's going to forecast some of the rest of the conversation. Has justice ever come from what happened in 1898?
I don't think so. I mean, 1898 remains one of the most flagrant cases of unrepaired racial injustice in American history. And I think reparations are a very appropriate remedy here. I'm not an expert on what form they should take, but the point is that, yes, a great injustice was done. It has not been repaired. And, you have state complicity, you have documented victims, you have documented descendants. And so I think unless you're arguing that reparations are never appropriate, Wilmington is a very, very obvious place to start.
Yeah. I want to talk about some of the individuals who are central to this. I don't even have the right words. I'm going to be blunt with you, Lauren. Just this terrible scar on American history. You write early in the book about an enslaved man, birth name Oboto. He arrives in Wilmington in the early 1800s and ultimately becomes free. Tell us about him and why he's part of this book.
I mentioned Cynthia Brown a bit earlier. Oboto, who was renamed Anthony Walker Howe, is the patriarch of the Howe family, who were a distinguished, established family of Black builders in Wilmington. Those are Cynthia Brown's descendants. But what's so important and interesting about the Howes is that they built a dynasty in Wilmington, and in the course of 30 years between emancipation and Reconstruction and 1898. So they were doers, they were builders, they were people who had immense energy and ambition. And so I wanted to go back to the patriarch and to show what he had passed down and what the family was building as 1898 approached.
So you mention this family, the Howes, who built an empire. In your book, you also focus on the Moores, the Halseys, and the Bellamy/McCraes, two family names there. And I want to cut you loose here. I want you to tell us about those families. But I guess as we do that as well, set the scene for us, please, about what Wilmington is like from your research, from your understanding in this period that you're speaking of. from enslavement through the Civil War up until the late 1800s. What's the city like?
Well, there was a unique political situation in Wilmington in the run-up to 1898. And what happened is that a movement called Fusion, which united mostly white populists and Black Republicans, the party of Lincoln, comes on the scene in North Carolina in 1894. And this was as I said, a unique political experiment in interracial cooperation, a multiracial coalition working together in common class interests. And so in 1896, Fusionists sweep the elections in North Carolina. And in 1898, Fusionists controlled Wilmington's city government. So 3 of the 10 aldermen were Black. There was this resurgence of political power, increased professional opportunity, and social equality in Wilmington. So I argue that the dream of Reconstruction lasted longer, in a sense, in Wilmington than anywhere else.
And if you would, expound a little bit about my terms here, diverse economic vibrancy, and you're alluding to it there are some layers of integration and representation that are quite frankly uncommon most other places in the United States at that point in the late 19th century.
Wilmington in 1898 was a bastion of Black success and of Black political success as well. There was a flourishing cultural life, a thriving middle class with lawyers, educators, entrepreneurs. Wilmington had become a symbol of Black hope and possibility and achievement, only for this to all come to a violent end on November 10th, 1898.
Lauren Collins is with us. She is the author of They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup, and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. She's also a journalist and staff writer at The New Yorker. So offer the counterpoint here, or the hinge, the pivot, the forces. So on one hand, there is this multi-ethnic there's, as you just described, there's this American city where Reconstruction is working and is flourishing. But clearly, some forces do not like that and wanted to tear it down. Who and what do they start to do?
Well, so Jeff, once the Fusion movement started encountering some success, the Democrats, who at that time represented states' rights and social conservatism, started asking themselves, how can we get white voters? How can we get the white populace? How can we lure them back to the Democratic Party? And the answer that they hit upon was white supremacy. This is not an anachronism. This is what they called it. They centered their 1898 campaign around the, I quote, all-important and paramount question of white supremacy. So, yeah, they decided that they were going to break up this interracial coalition, and the way that they were going to get back in power was to make race the critical issue of the 1898 elections.
And these are not fringe figures or fringe ideas. Tell us a little bit more about newspaper publishers or electeds or folks running for office or major donors. Who are the real influential people who are driving this effort?
I'm so glad you brought that up. These were not marginal people or a few bad apples. These were the leading lights of a political party, which was the Democrats, of the church, of the military. They were business moguls, the press. Josephus Daniels, News and Observer, was instrumental in creating this kind of right-wing media machine that laid the ground all year long for the coup in Wilmington in November. So, yeah, it's really important to remember that this was not spontaneous, and it was exactly as you said. It was the pillars, so-called pillars of society who were leading this. And we can get into the parallels to today later on if you want. But I do think the role that the media played in this is very interesting, and it's very important. Josephus Daniels invented this kind of like proto-spam where they would send out papers to people who had never signed up for them or wanted them, but you would get the paper in your mailbox and yes, the press was very, very instrumental in creating this kind of hysteria and this panic that, prepared the ground for 1898.
And I think that for some who have a little bit of knowledge about this, what you're saying might run counter to the narrative of, this was a riot, this was an uprising, this is something that happened, just after around an election. But reminder here, there wasn't, I don't believe, an election in 1898 with local governments in Wilmington, right? This was a premeditated run-up. And I want you to go a little bit deeper on the Secret Nine and what is happening specifically in this run-up as they prepare for something.
So actually there was an election, but what is interesting to know about this is so November 8th comes, November 8th, 1898. That's Election Day. And despite widespread intimidation and voter suppression, or because of it, I think is more likely, no violence materializes. Election Day is peaceful. The Democrats cruise to victory on November 8th. However, the city government was not up for election for another year.
All right.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
And they were impatient. The Democrats said, you know what? We just won every single office. We're not going to wait. We're going to keep going. And the next day, on November 9th, a notice appears in the local newspaper. Attention, white men. There is further business to be transacted. I'm slightly mangling the quote, but in the business of white supremacy. And the white men of Wilmington are called to the courthouse where they issue a white declaration of independence. That's what they called it. And they say they're going to take black men's jobs and give them to white men. Alexander Manly, the editor of the black newspaper, has to leave the city in 24 hours. And I quote, "We will no longer be ruled and we will never be ruled again by men of African origin." So this is what's happening on November 8th, on November 9th, before we get to November 10th, the day of the massacre and coup.
The Wilmington newspaper that you referenced there, the Wilmington Daily Record, the publisher, the founder, Alexander Manly, is chased out of town. Take us through the horrific next couple of days.
So after the white men issue the Declaration of Independence, they send a letter to 30-some leading black men in town. And they say, we will give you until 7:30 tomorrow morning to bring a reply. And the letter, communicates all of these threats that I just told you from the White Declaration of Independence. And so the black men get together, they're faced with no good choices. If they don't reply, it's going to be horrible. If they do reply, it's going to be horrible. But they compose a letter, and it's trying to keep the peace. And they nominate someone to go drop it in the mailbox. Except that the white men have paramilitaries and block patrols basically all over the city. So the man, Armand Scott, who was nominated to go deliver the letter, basically realizes that this is a suicide mission, and he decides to drop it in a mailbox. Now, the next day, November 10th, 1898, about 1,000 white men gather at the Wilmington Light Infantry in the morning. One of the white leaders knew that Scott had mailed the reply, but he uses the lack of response as a pretext to rile up the mob. And they walk to the Daily Record. They burn it down. Alexander Manly, fortunately, has already left town, or he probably would have been lynched. And then this is the beginning of what one witness described as the day that all hell broke loose.
I'm going to ask a question, and I hope it doesn't sound like I'm putting my foot totally in my mouth here, but this level of rage and exercising almost impunity. There have been conflicts in our country before, but oftentimes somebody fires the first shot or somebody is under immense and immediate threat. You just depicted 1,000 white men gathering, ready, picking up arms, ready to go to battle against people in their community. Where in the world did that confidence come from?
Well, this is something that I hope people will really take away from this book, which is that white supremacist violence is a through line of our country's history, not a flashback or a regression or a blip. And 1898 demonstrates that white supremacists will take what they think is theirs until the consequences of such acts outweigh the spoils. I mean, I also want to mention that both, and I'm bringing it into the present day now, but
okay, please.
Both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have repeatedly identified white nationalists as America's most persistent and lethal terrorist threat. So I think the word that you used, Jeff, impunity, is a very, very important one. After this happened, people in Wilmington who were suffering appealed to McKinley, who was the president. One of them wrote a letter, an anonymous letter, and she said, "I'm a citizen of the city of Wilmington, North Carolina. Are we to die like rats in a trap?" And McKinley didn't send federal troops. He didn't really do anything. It was 30 years after the Civil War, and equal protection was sacrificed on the altar of white unity, which I think we've seen over and over again in our country's history.
Lauren Collins is with us here on Due South. We're a moment or two away from a break, but before we get there, if you would, Lauren, please describe the rapid-fire Colt machine gun that was part of this early November massacre.
This was a gun that the white conspirators ordered well in advance of November 10th, 1898. And in fact, the cruelty of this incident gets me every time. But when it arrived in Wilmington, they invited, I use that word somewhat ironically, but
You're forgiven.
Thank you. They demanded that a bunch of the leaders of the Black community come out and watch a demonstration of this gun. This is the thing, one of the things I really want to emphasize about this is that people knew this was coming. They wrote to their elected officials, they made appeals to the president, and those who could have stopped this wouldn't, and those who would have couldn't. And that is part of the great tragedy of 1898.
Lauren Collins is our guest here on Due South. Her new book, recently released, is titled They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. It was, as you've heard us say already this hour, the only successful coup in the history of the United States, though it certainly offers some lessons and some connections to present-day America. We're going to ask Lauren about those, as well as the legacy for some of the families who endured November 1898 in Wilmington. We'll be back in a moment on Due South on listener-supported WUNC News. Welcome back, Due South, listener-supported WUNC News. I'm Jeff Tiberii, speaking with Lauren Collins this hour. She's a staff writer at The New Yorker, journalist, Wilmington native, and author of They Stole a City. Long title, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. How many people died?
We don't know. One report put the number of deaths at 22. I think the real number is much higher for several reasons. First of all, I think many of the bodies were likely never found. They may have been buried quietly. You also have to remember that the city's only Black newspaper had just been burned. So there was nowhere to memorialize the dead. So I think, estimates range anywhere from dozens to hundreds. I think the real number is likely on the higher side. But the answer is, Jeff, we will never know.
I don't want to glorify or harp on graphic and terrible imagery, but at the same time, this is the story and this is the history. And I'm wondering for you, what images, whether they're depictions or actual images you've seen, but when you think back on 1898, what are some of the the images that linger for you?
Something that comes back to me over and over again is the experience of Athalia Howe, who was Cynthia Brown's great-grandmother. Athalia is in her teens in 1898, and she's in her house in the Brooklyn neighborhood on the morning of November 10th. She looks out the window, and she watches a white man kill a black man in the street. Knows that something horrible is happening, runs to her church, St. Stephen Church. And when she gets there, the white men with guns kidnap the pastor and drag him off at gunpoint. So Athalia's with her mother. She's with her sister. They know at this point that they're on their own. Her father is down at the docks working. The family's separated. So they're gathering people along the way. They run to the Pine Forest Cemetery, which is the Black cemetery in Wilmington, and they take refuge there along with likely hundreds of other women and children for days. It was November. It was cold. There were infants there. No one was dressed properly. They'd come in a hurry. Nobody had food. And so the thought of these people being driven from their homes, taking refuge in the swamps and waiting it out to see what was going to happen is something that, I have thought of over and over again in the course of writing this book.
And you, to a degree, you bookend that. If I'm remembering the characters correctly, I have the book next to me. It's not open at the moment as we chat.
There are a lot of people in the book. Right.
But I believe that woman that you just talked about, the young Howe, on her deathbed was still thinking of that moment. Do I have that right?
You do. So after 1898, Athalia goes to work as the head cook at Live Oaks, the estate of the Parsley family, a white family who were deeply enmeshed in 1898 and in the power structure that it secured for the white elite in Wilmington. Athalia works for the Parsleys for decades, and late in life, she's living in Pennsylvania with her daughter. Cynthia Brown, whom I mentioned before, goes to visit. She walks into the bedroom where her great-grandmother lies dying, and Athalia grabs her hand and says, "If it ever happens, run." Now, Cynthia was a child. She had no idea what Athalia was talking about. And, she's grabbing her wrist and her parents kind of hustle her out of the bedroom. But that was a moment that stayed with Cynthia for the rest of her life. Her ancestors' desperate need to warn her that this wasn't over and that this could happen again.
Lauren Collins with us here on Due South chatting about her recently released book, They Stole a City. Lauren, we reference these families, the Bellamy or McCraes, the Moores, the Howes, and the Halls, these two white families, two black families. Why are they central to your book?
I chose to write about families because, let me start by saying, this is an intimate history. It is a history of families. It's a history of the way that people still carry this with them. I don't see 1898 as an isolated historical event, and I wanted to capture that full sweep. I wanted people to see with clear eyes exactly what happened on those days. But I wanted people to understand through these four families where it all came from and all the ways that this event has continued to unfold. I was thinking about inheritance. I was thinking about legacy. And I was thinking about the way that history can be preserved and transmitted, also warped and distorted through families, and how hard it can be for the truth to come out. Particularly in the white families that I write about, when you feel that you're hearing it from people who are dear to you. I spend a lot of time with the McCrae family, for example, and the Bellamy family on white women, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, and their role in creating 1898 and then shaping its memory or dismemory, which is an aspect of the story that I believe has been underreported. So I really wanted to get into the way that this lived in families, rather than presenting it as an event that, started at 10 a.m. and was over by 5 p.m. on November 10th, 1898.
Right. And I'm going to hopefully delicately play the role of editor only briefly. And I know you just said the word lived, but I think it's lives. It's not past tense to a degree, right? Like you talk about this. There are through lines to today. I want to turn to the present day. I mean, there's so much, right? I mean, my mind immediately goes to January 6th, or did it several times when I'm spending time with this text. You write in the book about a campaign stop that President Trump, then candidate Trump, made in 2016 in Wilmington, and you draw some direct connections.
Well, I mean, let me speak to the parallels between 1898 and American politics today as I see them. The origins of the crises that we are living through today are right here in our own violent past. You have white backlash against Black political progress, amplified by a right-wing media machine whipping up this sense of racial grievance and loss. You have white supremacist paramilitaries. They were called red shirts then. And you have impunity for political violence. You mentioned January 6th. They got away with it, just like they did in 1898. And then after this violent coup in Wilmington, there was an active program to bury this history until very recently. And I argue that we're seeing the same effort today to suppress inconvenient, uncomfortable history.
How do you roll it forward? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I have thought about this. And I think we have to channel the hope of 1897 while heeding the lessons of 1898. So I think a lot about the people in this book and in this story who didn't succumb to hopelessness or desperation. I think about there was a group of Black women, they called themselves an organization of colored ladies, who publicly defended Alexander Manly and urged Black men to vote, even in the face of widespread intimidation. I think about Benjamin Franklin Keith, who was one of the only white men who stood up to the white supremacists. And the story is not over, as you said. Wilmingtonians are now finding ways to challenge this drive for suppression and erasure that I mentioned. So I think it's encouraging that people are trying to make sense of this and seek the truth, and this book is a part of that effort.
We talk about 1898. I asked you when the story began. I think we're in some level of agreement that the story is not over or does not have a complete or official or appropriate ending. How could the story of Wilmington's 1898 massacre see a conclusion?
I think, first of all, education is key in this. As I mentioned, strides have been made. I think there's more to do. I also take away the idea of cross-class and cross-racial coalitions. The Reverend William Barber explicitly invokes the Fusionists as a model for the movement that he's putting together. I think we need to take the white supremacist terror threat seriously. This is a real problem. This is a known problem. And again, I think that some sort of reparations are absolutely appropriate and needed in the case of Wilmington. So those are some of the things that I see as important pieces moving forward. There's also a new museum, an 1898 museum in the works in Wilmington. So those are some of the things, when you ask where do we go from here, that's what comes to mind for me.
One of the families you wrote about is the McCraes, the McCrae family, and there was a McCrae Park in Wilmington in New Hanover County near a very busy and bustling intersection. The name of that park has been changed in recent years while you were working on this book. Are there other vestiges? Are there other reminders or markers or names on buildings or things that we ought to be talking about and perhaps ought to be considered for alteration?
Yes. So in 2020, Hugh McCrae Park, the name was changed to Longleaf Park. I would argue that Alexander Manly Park might have been a more appropriate name change rather than a sort of inanimate plant name. But yes, I mean, one of the things, this is kind of an aside in the book, but there is a middle school to this day named after H.M. Rowland, who was a superintendent of schools in the 50s and 60s. And he went around after his tenure. This was in the midst of the fight over school desegregation, passing around race science pamphlets that claimed that Black students were inherently less intelligent than white ones. And so everywhere you look, there are reminders of the story. I think, people, I talked about the suppression of history, but these places often reveal so much to us and can help us remember what happened and how much work there is to do to remedy it.
Lauren, this is a selfish question, admittedly, but as a journalist, I'm wondering where this project took you, from anger to sadness to hope to confusion. Like, I imagine this is maybe different than anything else that you've worked on in your career.
It absolutely is. And yes, as you intuited, I went through the whole cycle of emotions in writing this book. I mean, I reassessed a lot of things about the way I had been brought up, about relationships. I felt a lot of disappointment and alienation, you're right. But I've also felt reconnection and, incredible amounts of admiration for the people in Wilmington who are doing things to grapple with this history and to bring the truth to fore. I think what I've really taken away, it's really important for us to understand our history. And it's not going to solve all our problems, but I've seen how damaging it can be to suppress the truth, and I've seen how good it can be when we confront it.
You write in your book that it's white history as much as it is Black history, which I think is a very important note to reiterate and utter. You have children. I have children. How do you talk to or plan to talk to your kids about this chapter of North Carolina and American history?
My kids are coming to my event in Wilmington tonight, and I'm really glad they're going to be there. I think it is so important to educate young people about this. I wanted to be clear about my perspective and my identity, which is why I situate myself in my relationship to 1898 in the introduction. And yes, as I've spoken about both the need for education and the power of families as vectors of transmission. And I think where those ideas come together is in our own kids. Yes, it is so important to talk to kids about this, for them to know their history, for them to understand what it means.
The Wilmington Massacre of 1898 is one of the most important chapters in North Carolina history. Although it has been undertold for decades, the only successful coup in the history of the United States, a new book about the years, decades, century running up to the Massacre of 1898 and the long impacts that continue to this day. The book is out now. It is titled They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. The scribe behind the book is Lauren Collins. You can pick it up today wherever you get books. Lauren Collins is a journalist, staff writer at The New Yorker, and a native of Wilmington. Lauren, thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's finish this show with a passage from Lauren Collins' book in a section where she writes about her own upbringing in Wilmington decades ago. Quote, "This was the 1990s, not the 1890s, but my family and I were sometimes dismissed as Yankees, still considered a stinging epithet. We benefited from passivity, from not asking questions whose answers would have made our lives difficult. As white, upper-class newcomers, we were part of the Wilmington cover story, alibis for a new South that didn't quite exist. I consider myself an implicated subject per a category of political responsibility defined by UCLA scholar Michael Rothberg, enmeshed and liable even though I don't have a direct tie to the 1898 massacre and coup. As Rothberg argues, the traditional binary of victims and perpetrators or descendants thereof doesn't sufficiently account for the complexity of our relationships to historical violence and the contemporary inequities it creates. There is no such thing as what the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl once called the mercy of late birth, expressing relief at having missed the Nazism by simple demographic luck. If you're a German, you're part of the Nazi story. If you're a Wilmingtonian, an American for that matter, you're part of 1898. Close quote. That passage comes from Lauren Collins' new book titled They Stole a City, Wilmington's White Supremacist Coup and the Families Who Live with Its Legacy. I'm Jeff Tiberii. You've been listening to Due South on WUNC News.
Each story you hear on Planet Money starts with a question. What happens if we refund tariffs? Why are groceries so expensive? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious, because the forces shaping our world can be hard to see. Follow NPR's Planet Money wherever you get your podcasts and start seeing how the economy really works.